is just literally 10 years ago. I was an infantry officer, got injured in Afghanistan, and ended up back in Walter Reed. We may have shared some of the same ICUs. I don't know what your story is, but a big change to my life. So, it's kind of like top of the world, doing the stuff I wanted to do. Was fortunate enough to be in charge of a really great platoon, doing really important things, and at the peak of my physical shape, all sorts of stuff mentally, and then all of a sudden you get injured, and it instantaneously you go from being vertical to being horizontal, or at least seated, for a year plus, whatever. That was my story. I know other folks have much worse than that, and it is a huge change, as everybody here knows, in terms of how you view yourself and in terms of what path you see your life on. And I want to relate that a little bit to the topic. What we really want to talk about here today is entrepreneurship, is because what I was forced to do, what you are forced to do right now, is reinvent yourself at many different levels. And just having since then, I realized that is kind of, I have 3 kids, and every time we had a kid, I realized I have to reinvent myself. These are traumatic instances. Trauma is not always necessarily bad, but it is a life-changing event where you have to make a big decision in yourself about what you're going to be moving forward, because you can't necessarily be what you were in the past. In business, that's actually, going to Walter Reed is actually great training for entrepreneurship, because I'm fortunate enough to study at Stanford. They do a lot of entrepreneurship out there. What they find is the two big determinants of success in a new business is, 1, the market it enters. If it's a growing market, it's going to be much more successful. But 2 is how quickly it can reinvent itself. Businesses, Facebook, all these guys, all they did was iterate, change until they landed on the right thing, and then boom, then there they are. It's a simplified way of thinking about it, but all I'm saying is that what you are living right now is actually a very unique experience that, if you apply it to business, is actually a few dividends you can draw from it. Number 1, I've been through the medical evaluation board process. I've been through Walter Reed. I went to school, grad school, after when I realized that this was not going to continue for me, that I needed to figure out something else. I went to grad school to get educated in something else. I did that through vocational rehabilitation through the VA. So if anybody has questions about that, happy to talk about my experience. And then from there, I joined the Boston Consulting Group, which is a big global consultancy, and that's where I met Joshua.
Yep, I'm also an Army veteran. Had a little bit of overlap with Zach at West Point, as was mentioned. A couple deployments myself, but fortunate that I didn't spend any time at Walter Reed myself. But after a handful of deployments, decided for various reasons Army wasn't for me. I went to school as well. Generally the same time frame as Zach, but on the GI Bill. And after I graduated, went and worked at BCG, and Zach and I were working on one of these big projects I was mentioning, charging big fees. Somewhat coincidentally, at the Pentagon was where we met. Kind of really interesting first job post-military to be an outside-in perspective.
I sat in this class and I learned about service disabled veteran-owned small business. I learned about people starting businesses, doing all sorts of things. I learned all these things, but I didn't actually come to fruition until, I think, 5 years later. But it actually did. It was still there when I was sitting at this job saying, I want to do something else, and I immediately hearkened back to this. So I just would want to make that note for you, is that maybe starting a business right now is right for you. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But this is good. I'm glad to see you're here, because this is good information that can be applicable later on. This literally was it. I remember I called up Joshua, and I was talking about something else, and he said, hey, yeah, you know what, I don't like working 80 hours a week for somebody else either. Maybe we should start this business. We actually started out thinking we were going to go buy a small business and then turn it around, run it, whatever you want to do, through raising a search fund to do that. Spent a whole bunch of time, probably like 6 months, exploring that idea pretty in depth. Came to the conclusion that was not the right path for us. It's the right path for some other people. It just wasn't for us at the time. We prefer to maintain the equity versus giving it up to investors who have to provide us money to purchase that business. So we pivoted from that, and we realized that the skills that we had learned at BCG were very much in need in the government space. There's lots of small businesses running around the government doing a lot of things, but what we saw was that a lot of them could not apply the skills and the capabilities that we could And so we saw a seam in the market. We said they've got these preferences for small businesses. The client desires higher level capabilities, but those two things rarely overlap. Here's our entry into the market. It is a classification of a small business. The federal government has targets for how much of their procurement will go to SDVOSBs or other small businesses. And it creates an incentive for the government, for a large business prime contractor to work with you if you are an SDVOSB. You can only be an SDVOSB if you've been rated 0% or higher by the VA. You have to be a 51% owner of the business at least, and you have to be the chief officer, the one making all the strategic decisions. And there's all sorts of protections and verifications put into place to try to prevent folks from, like we were talking about earlier, the shell games, where somebody says, you be the front man and I'm actually going to do all the work. You can get in big trouble doing that. So if you can get that status, if you get that certified, and you have to go through the VA to do that, it makes it easier to do business with the federal government. But I will caution you, and we have lived this very viscerally, is that this is a crowded marketplace. There are lots of SDVOSBs out there bidding on the same stuff that you want to bid on. So if you show up and say, I'm an SDVOSB, how can I do work for you? You're going to spend 6 months to a year spinning your wheels on that, because the government, there's all sorts of incentives at play, and there's lots of other alternatives there. So the first step shouldn't be, I want to make an SDVOSB. The first step should be, I want to do this. I want to provide this service. I want to provide this product. I want to whatever. You identify that seam in the market, and then being an SDVOSB can be a kicker for that. We came up with this idea, and then we worked out a deal with BCG before we left to do subcontract work with them when we left. And that's just our specific example, but we made an effort to try to identify our first customer before we left our job. BCG is one of our biggest clients to this day. We've worked continuously with them since we started the business. We worked out an operating agreement. It's very important, right? To spend a lot of time on that. But literally, I remember we typed it up, or we had templates, but then we edited it and all that stuff. And once we got it, and I had this piece of paper, I said, okay, Josh, where do we submit this? Who do I give this to? And he's like, no, you don't submit it to anybody. It's like a will. You kind of you can hold on to it, you can give it to other people, but that's it. You have an operating agreement. You both signed it. But once we had that, we registered. You go register with the IRS. You get your EIN. We registered with the state. Registered with SAM, which is if you want to do business with the government, you just fill out this form, and then you register with the VA, and then we got a bank account, a logo, and we're in business.
So pros and cons, basically, to owning your own business. A lot of times, the pro and the con is the same thing, right? So number one, you're your own boss. So that's awesome, right? Because nobody can tell you what to do. You can sleep in if you want to. You can do whatever you want to do. But the boss is also responsible for certain things, like making, especially when you're a small company, like making that sale. Who's going to make that first sale, the second, the third? Eventually, you'll have other people doing that for you. All the value that you will create if you own will accrues to the owners of the business. So if that's just you, or if you have a partner, all of that accrues to you. One of the big kind of light bulb moments for me when I was at the Boston Consulting Group is when you one day figure out how much your company, as in the professional services, is billing you out to clients for. I don't know the exact number, but it was literally millions of dollars a year that they would bill me out individually, personally, to clients. And you realize, wow, there's a really big gap between how much money I'm making, the benefits I'm receiving, and then the money that the company's receiving. Where is that money? And it was like, oh, it's the owner. I think I want to be an owner. And so that was a big realization. But then it's the same as on the flip side is if that number turns negative, if all of a sudden you aren't able to, in our case, in professional services, what we're selling is kind of the time of employees and ourselves. That difference, that delta between the revenue and the cost is yours, that number can be negative sometimes. So that's a big risk that you need to be willing to take on. Like Zach said, we mitigated portions of this by establishing those first one or two sales before we left the full-time job. Regardless of what rank you were in the military, you were a part of, built, participated in teams, and that's really, really cool. I mean, I think we all enjoyed that, and certainly as people transition from active duty military or reserves or whatever the case may be to veteran status, that's typically one of the biggest things that people will miss is that. And so being able to build that from scratch is a very exciting thing. But there's a con to that, which is the same thing, which is you have to build a team from scratch, and that can be difficult. What if you hire an employee who doesn't perform the way that you would like them to? Again, when you're in the military, there's a pretty big support system to support you in those instances, but that doesn't really exist as much when you're an entrepreneur.
You hire somebody, they create value, you bill for that value, and then you get paid.
Yeah.
But the entire time you're paying for that person. It's a very simple concept, but it became very real for me when it happened the first time, and you start to realize you got to have 2 months cash on hand at least for whoever you're going to hire.
We have twice, if you compare the amount of cash we have on hand to the amount of unpaid invoices that we have two times the cash we have on hand we have is in unpaid invoices. So we're like constantly calling people, hey man, like I did this stuff for you. You're supposed to
be nice if you paid.
Yeah, you could pay me.
Great.
Like we get to work with whom we want to work with. So we spend a lot of time with the VA because it's a client we're passionate about. We do work at DoD. We do work at nonprofits. We do work specifically at the clients that we want to work in professional services. That's what you're selling. The flip side to that is, being at BCG, they would tell me, hey, you're going to go do this for that client. But again, they trained me how to do that. And so now if I say, man, I really want to go, I would really love to work for a nonprofit, I'd love to do this thing for them, I got to figure that out myself. Like there's nobody there to train me, to train Zach, to do the thing that we want to do. So you have to.
When we first started this business, I realized that one of the things that I didn't appreciate at the company I worked for was that somebody spent a lot of time selling work for me to do.
Yeah.
And when I left that business, I had to sell the work for me to do. And you start to appreciate, like again, these are all risk-reward decisions. When we left the military, we decided to go to grad school. It's a very risk-averse decision. I'm keeping more options open versus closing off and focusing on one. When I left business school, we went to a consulting firm. Again, that's a risk-averse decision. It's a job that creates lots of options, but I'm sub-optimizing the amount of value that I can capture from those options. But then when we decided to do this was a very risk-heavy decision, in which we said, you know what, we've made this decision. We're going to invest here, and we're going to go for it. And that because of that, there's a higher risk-reward ratio that we have access to, which can be a good or a bad thing. But I think that in general, our conclusion is, if you would ask me, do you recommend starting your own business? I'd say absolutely. I think everybody should start their own business at some point in their life. But I don't necessarily think it should be now. Like I think it should be when it's right for you. And I think you have to be very clear with the people close to you what the risks are that you're taking on.
To create wealth, you need to make very concentrated bets on a small number of ideas. To maintain wealth, you need to make a lot of diverse bets on a lot of diverse things. And by the way, like Zach and I don't necessarily we specifically do not define wealth necessarily as money. To us, actually, like time is probably way more valuable than the money aspect of it. The long-term vision of our firm is that we're able to make a sufficient amount of money to support our families in kind of the minimum amount of time on a weekly basis. Like if I can work 1 hour a day and make enough money to support my family, that is my definition of success.
One thing I'd say is the average age of an entrepreneur in the U.S. is 43 years old.